Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we'll talk about returning to using public transport and what would give us the confidence to do so. We're specifically interested today in disabled people's experiences of travelling by public transport during this pandemic, both the good and the bad. My name is Emma Scott. I'm the Operations Manager at Disability Equality Scotland, and I'm joined today by my colleague Ali Bruce, who will be helping to facilitate the session from behind the scenes. Over the past few months, many of us have not accessed public transport in line with the government guidelines. But this webinar will give you an opportunity to hear firsthand from operators across different modes of transport about the measures that they have in place to ensure their service is safe. Today is an opportunity for you to either share your experiences of travel during lockdown or to share why you might have chosen so far not to travel by public transport. First of all, let me explain how today's session will work and how you can interact with us. At any time during today's webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's panel. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A box, which is in the bottom control panel. And as time allows, the panel will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session. If you would prefer to ask a panelist a question directly, then please say so in the Q&A box and we can select you to speak. At this point, you'll have to manually unmute yourself to be heard. Now, we have BSL support with us today. If you'd like to ask a question via BSL, then please indicate so in the Q&A box and Ali will add you to the panel so that we'll be able to see you by video. If you're having any technical difficulties today using Zoom, then please type the issue you're having into the comments box and we'll try our best to resolve this for you. We also have live captioning provided today. If you'd like to view the closed captioning, please click the button that says closed captioning on the bottom control panel and it should appear on your screen. Now, we're recording today's session and we'll share the link with you after the event. You'll also receive a very short evaluation survey, which will help us to improve future webinars. So please take the time to give us your feedback. Just to reiterate, if you're having any trouble at all following the discussion today, then please let us know in the comments box and we will try to resolve it. But let me set today in context for you. Disability Equality Scotland has been engaging with its membership over the last few months on various impacts of COVID-19. And for this particular topic, we've been working with Transport Scotland. Now, the guidance from the Scottish Government has been to restrict travel and only to use it if absolutely necessary. But the hope is that we can return to using public transport as part of our new normal. That's why Transport Scotland are very keen to hear from disabled people about their experiences of using public transport during lockdown, as well as the reasons why some people may have concerns about using transport again. Transport Scotland are specifically interested to hear from people with sensory impairments to gather their views and experiences. So to inform today's discussion, Disability Equality Scotland circulated a poll question to our members, asking for respondents to tell us about their concerns about returning to public transport. Now, the results showed us that changes to timetables, changes to capacity in terms of the number of seats or space available, and the availability of passenger assistance were all key concerns. So today we'll have a short discussion about some of the key issues disabled people identified. We'll hear from disabled people with experience of using public transport in the last few months, as well as from transport providers who'll tell us what they've been doing to help make their service safer and secure for people to travel. But let me start today by introducing our panel. We're joined by Paul White, Director of Confederation of Passenger Transport, that's representing the bus and the coach industry. We've got Demi Wiley, who's the Accessibility and Planning Manager from Caledonian MacBrayne Ferries. We've got Mark O'Malley from ScotRail, who's the Customer Experience and Strategy Manager. Morning, Mark. And we have Hussein Patwa and Michael Torno, both from the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland. We're also joined by Karen Armstrong, who's the Acting Head of Transport Accessible Travel Policy at Transport Scotland. Hi, Karen. And Nicola Wilson, who's the Head of Transport Policy Integration. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for giving up your time this morning. I'm going to start by handing straight over to Karen, who's going to give an update on the Accessible Travel Framework, and also Nicola, who will tell us a little bit about the National Transport Strategy and to set today's discussion in context. Karen.
Hi, I'm just going to close my window because someone's came to cut grass. One second. Apologies, always happens. Yes, good morning, everybody, and I'd like to also thank everybody for signing up and taking the time out today to attend this webinar. As Emma says, I'm heading up the Accessible Travel Policy team. As many of you will know, we have responsibility for the Accessible Travel Framework. That was a co-produced piece of work back in 2016, and it has a list of 40 issues within it. Last year we moved to an annual delivery plan with a agreed set of 8 priorities. Now that work was paused back in March, and like many other civil servants, my team was pivoted into other roles. Some of us spent time in health, resilience, and I was also working in bus restart and recovery. So I just wanted to give you a wee idea of what has been happening over the past few months. So although the framework has been paused, work in many areas has continued in albeit a limited capacity. So in terms of the team, we've been working closely with Disability Equality Scotland to continue work on our hate crime charter that we had started prior to the pandemic. We've already had some conversations with those operators that had already been involved to see what our next steps are. We've also been working very closely with SESTRANS in relation to the Thistle Assistance Card, which was adapted very quickly to include face exemptions back in May. In terms of other pieces of work, lots of you that are on the call, or lots of the organisations that you are part of, have also stepped up over the past few months and supported us in work. So there's been several pieces of guidance. And to name a few, MACS, the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland, worked at pace to help support guidance for disabled travellers. I know that they have also been involved in providing guidance in terms of the reallocation of street spaces. RNIB and guide dogs have also worked swiftly to introduce guidance. So the whole purpose of today, and Emma touched on it, why are we here? I have been lucky over the past few months to have had a range of roles within government, and one of them was working on bus restart and recovery and working very closely with Paul. I also had regular catch-ups with both ScotRail and Ferries colleagues, as well as aviation colleagues who are not here today. And from the work that I was doing in bus, it was very, very apparent to me that operators were going to great lengths to introduce different measures to help and support all of us navigate the new normals. But I fully appreciate that there's still things that could be done. I have not been on public transport since the middle of March. So my knowledge, my expertise of a daily commute is no longer there. And I know that for some of you, you're in the same position. You're maybe not travelling for the same reasons as me. I have the luxury of working from home, but there may be factors that are stopping you from travelling. Or as Emma said, you may well have travelled and it wasn't quite what you expected. So for me, this is a two-way conversation. It's about us coming together collectively. It's an opportunity for the operators who have done great work to update you on what it may look and feel like when travelling. But it's also an opportunity for you to feed in your fears, your reasons for not travelling, your reasons, you know, why you've had to travel, if it has worked well, or where there have been some problems. This today is also supports my team in terms of taking forward the accessible travel framework and any priorities within it. The priorities we agreed back in February to me no longer seem fit for purpose. However, I'll use them as a guide, and over the next few months, I want to engage and hear from as many people as possible. So please get involved today. We only know what we know. Listen, ask questions. No question is a daft question. And above all, enjoy. And I believe my colleague Nikki, who's leading work on the National Transport Strategy, is going to pick up.
Thank you, Karen. So there'll be three elements to the update that I will give you all today. So the first one, I'll give you a bit of an update on our response to COVID-19 and the work that we've been doing on Equalities and the Transport Transition Plan. I'll then touch a bit on the National Transport Strategy and also how we are exploring taking forward the Reducing Inequalities priority under the strategy. So first of all, in response to COVID-19, we developed or re-established a transport equality network to help us develop and implement the Transport Transition Plan. So the network have been great in supporting us in undertaking an equality impact assessment, a Fairer Scotland duty assessment, and also a child rights and wellbeing impact assessment. So membership of the group, it includes representatives, groups of those who have protected characteristics. Given the nature of the actions that have been undertaken through the Transport Transition Plan, the work of the group has tended to lead towards accessibility. And we've really just been trying to understand more thoroughly what the implications of COVID have had on transport as a whole. So if I leave that there, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and if I touch a bit on the National Transport Strategy just now, because they'll start to tie in, as you'll see here later. So just before COVID and lockdown, we published our National Transport Strategy a wee back in February. This strategy was developed through a three-pillared process of collaborative working with partners, establishing an evidence base, and also engaging with stakeholders from across the country. So the strategy itself, it sets out a vision for Scotland's transport sector over the next 20 years, which is that we'll have a sustainable, inclusive, safe and accessible transport system, helping to deliver a healthier, fairer and more prosperous Scotland for communities, businesses and visitors. And underlying that vision are four priorities: reducing inequalities, takes climate action, helps deliver inclusive economic growth, and improves our health and wellbeing. Work on delivering the strategy was paused in order to accommodate a response to the COVID-19 crisis. And we are currently in a space now where we'll continue to respond to COVID-19, but we're also looking to go back to the day job, so to speak. So we are currently developing our first National Transport Strategy delivery plan. And that's going to focus on the actions being undertaken by the Scottish Government to achieve the vision and the priorities. And we also will continue to work with stakeholders as we implement the strategy, the delivery plan. So this delivery plan, it's going to be published at the end of this year, and it's also going to take into account the impact of COVID-19. And that's where the evidence base that we've obtained through the equality impact assessments for the Transport Transition Plan will come into play. So our understanding is that the National Transport Strategy still remains valid and the priorities are still applicable, but our starting point from where we deliver the strategy has changed considerably since February. So to really make sure that we've got a clear understanding of the challenges that people are facing with regard to inequalities and transport, I'm currently working to establish a Transport Reducing Inequalities Forum. So that is basically going to take the transport equality network that's been established and evolve that into the forum. And the easiest way and probably the most simplest way to think of it is that the forum is an overarching platform under which there'll sit 3 groups. There'll be a citizens panel where we will look for individuals, and we will also engage with representative groups to hear their thoughts and feedback on how we're delivering the strategy. There'll be a steering group, which is a cross-government engagement, and there'll also be a community as well, which is the business and transport sector engagement and local authorities. So each of the groups are going to consider the areas in detail, identify policy actions and partnership opportunities for implementation. And the reason that we've taken this approach is it's such a complex landscape with transport and inequalities. So we're trying to provide a bit more structure to it. Also, to help us get that structure to the conversations that we're having, we are going to adopt the Poverty and Inequality Commission's framework on transport and poverty in Scotland, which was published last year, and we will adopt annual topics from that. So the forum will be established early next year, and the annual topic for next year is anticipated to be affordability. It will build on the work that we've done to develop the National Transport Strategy and also the Transport Transition Plan. But in the meantime, what I would say is we will continue to engage with partners on transport and accessibility in relation to both the Transition Plan and the National Transport Strategy through the Equality Network until the forum has been established. That's the end of my update. I'm quite happy to take any questions if anybody's got any.
Thanks, Nicola. I think what we'll do is we'll carry on with our discussion, and if any questions come through, I'll go through those as they arise. Thank you, though. That was really useful context from yourself and Karen. But what I want to do is come to the panel, if I can, and pick up on some of the points that were raised in our poll. So what I'll do, first of all, is come to Hussein and to Michael and ask you to maybe quickly summarise what your experience of travel has been in the last 6 months or so. And then I'll ask each of the transport providers if they wouldn't mind summarising how their service has changed, just to get us started. Hussein, could I come to you first of all? Can you maybe summarise briefly what your experience has been?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Hold on. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks, Hussein. Yeah, carry on.
Okay, thank you. So like many people, I've only been out just a handful of times since lockdown. I've been on a train 3 or 4 times, but I have to admit, I'm still not confident enough to travel by bus. And for me, the main challenges have been getting information about the new procedures in place, the new way of traveling, and it sounds odd even just to say that, because what do you mean by a way of traveling? But all the new different I suppose in the layman's terms, you would say hoops to jump through in order to get onto transport in the first place. So that's everything from how do you go about booking your ticket, because a lot of things are now being done online, to when you get to the bus, are there new ways of handling that process of boarding the bus, queuing, getting your ticket from the driver. How do you know which seats are restricted? Is that because they're a different color, or is there a tape across them? Is there a set rule of thumb about which seats you use and don't use on a bus? So getting information about all of these things has been quite challenging, even though the information about timetabling itself, I have to say, I think has been communicated really well by transport providers. And I think for me, the challenge is getting this information that really then directly impact on the confidence to travel. You're not sure about whether you're going to have a comfortable journey to begin with, or in some cases a safe journey. There are lots of things from a visually impaired perspective that we have to think about when traveling. You're focused on your surrounding environment, you're focused on where you're going. You've then got these added challenges of things to remember that need to be done because of the COVID restrictions and the ways in which we're now operating. And then on top of that, you've got these new challenges to bear in mind. And there's other people as well who are also confused, maybe unsure about the way to go. So it creates for quite an anxious environment all round. So for me, if to sum it up, I think if there's one thing that we need to do better, is to communicate that pre-journey information. And I know, for example, that ScotRail have been looking at some of this, how to inspire confidence to travel by telling people exactly what they need to know, not only about what they need to do about COVID, but the actual process they need to go through, right from planning their journey, getting to the transport, using the transport itself, and then leaving at the other end so they have a successful journey and something that they wish to repeat again in the future. Just to focus on a point that Karen made, which I think is quite pertinent in this case, there have been so many changes that have been made to our local town environments. The streets have changed, one-way systems. In Aberdeen, for example, they have these floating bus stops whereby the bus lane is now an extension of the pavement, so the bus basically stops in the middle of nowhere right in the street. And that's really quite frightening for me. Just knowing what to do when you get on that bus, you're in the middle of effectively an open street. And I think for that one reason, not knowing how that all works has prevented me from using buses. And it has a broader consequence as well, because I'm trying to, like many people, trying to use the most of my sight. I'm trying to keep my remaining vision. And the longer I go without doing the things that I used to do before, the more and more uncertain I become about being able to do them again in the future. And it's really about trying to keep up that independence and keep up that being able to go out and about.
Great, thank you, Hussein, that's really helpful. Michael, do you want to say very quickly what your experience has been over the last few months?
Absolutely. For people who don't know me, I am completely blind. I have a hearing impairment and I'm a guide dog owner. I was without a guide dog for 2 years and relied on a long cane between guide dogs. So I have some quite recent experience of trying to get around with a cane and then going back to using a dog. My main experience of using public transport since the lockdown has been train, the local kind of low-level sort of metro system that we have in Glasgow, and I've actually been using that quite regularly. When I've been traveling, I've been able to use a face mask, so that hasn't been an issue for me. What I suppose my experience is very much related to the fact that I have got a guide dog and I'm reasonably independent and don't need a lot of assistance because I have the guide dog. I think probably the experience I've had over the past couple of months would be a bit different if I was still having to rely on the cane. That being because what I have noticed is that there does seem to be a lot less in the way of visible staffing, both in the train stations, but also on board the trains. That's what's particularly noticeable, that there's been, I suppose, less of a staff presence. I think that has made me concerned a little bit that should I need assistance, there won't be anybody about to provide it. I have had the experience traveling on a high-speed train up to Dundee during the lockdown, and you know, there've been no announcements, or if there were announcements on the train, I wasn't able to hear them because they don't seem to have the automated announcements there on those trains, and there wasn't, you know, any staff about, so you know, that was a bit disconcerting. I haven't travelled by bus. I don't really travel by bus much anyway because I'm completely blind, and the buses in Glasgow don't have any announcements on them. I'm not really that familiar with how to use the apps and things, and I just find the service pretty dismal, to be honest, generally. So I can't imagine that it's got any more customer focused since the lockdown. But really reiterate all the things that Hussein has said. Just one further point: the changes, I would reiterate, particularly the changes to the local environment, the infrastructure in Glasgow and elsewhere. There are lots of adaptations that have been made to promote cycling, and in some places it means you have to walk across the cycle lane to get you know, to the bus stop. That is something that is a further aspect that would put me off trying to travel by bus, because I cannot hear or see the cyclists, and I know from you know, sighted people around me, cyclists are not conforming to the rules of the road that everybody else are.
Thank you, Michael. That's really useful insight, and to Hussein as well. If I could then just come to the transport providers in turn and ask you to summarise very briefly what changes you've been making and how your service has run over the last few months. Paul, can I come to you first from the kind of bus coach industry? Can you summarise what you've been up to?
Hi, yes. Please do let me know if I'm my microphone's clear enough and if I'm speaking too quickly. Okay, so I'm Paul White, the Director of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, which is the trade association for the bus and coach industries. I'm lucky enough to have met some of you beforehand, so you may know me. Yeah, for the bus sector, I think through COVID, the safety of passengers and staff has been paramount. I know that our members have never worked more closely as we look to share good practice and identify and resolve issues as they have presented themselves, which has been very challenging. We've been in frequent contact with Transport Scotland, Karen and our colleagues regularly, and from the out have created risk assessments for all the aspects of the coronavirus and the associated impact on public transport, and have updated those frequently to try and keep ahead of what has been a changing landscape. So we have been working at pace, and if there have been missteps along the way, then I can only apologise for that, but I hope you can appreciate that those are likely to happen or possible to happen in a situation like this. We have been reacting to travel restrictions. As you can imagine, social distancing has been a challenge. Driver shortages, as drivers have either been struck with COVID-19 or have had to social distance for 2 weeks. So, you know, that has been difficult, and evaluating what we should be doing against other conditions of carriage and safety has been an ongoing issue. I'd raise hand sanitizers as an example. That is one that we're frequently asked, why isn't there a hand sanitizer on buses? Well, the risk assessment from our engineering colleagues and bringing in external experts has been that it's a flammable liquid. If you have a dispenser, there's a spillage risk, and it's a very slippy substance to be putting on the floor of a bus. And it also creates lengthening boarding times and kind of bottleneck as people use the hand sanitizers as they board or leave the bus, which puts people in closer contact. So there you have something that people would say that's a positive you should introduce, but in weighing it up, the expert opinion has been there's negatives. So trying to decide what to do is a very difficult situation, and that's just one impact of what you can imagine. There's hundreds. We've been trying to minimise driver contact and introduce contactless payment where it hasn't been before. We have met with the Professor Jason Leach a couple of times to get his viewing on things like helping assistance to boarding and elements like that, so that we're doing what is the correct thing and trying to reassure drivers, because I think that's an important point. It's scary for people to be using. I completely sympathise with the views of Hussein and others who are scared to use public transport or uncertain, and our members are dealing with drivers who are scared and uncertain to drive the buses in these situations. So it's two-way. On masks, we have look to encourage people to use masks, where and anecdotally we're seeing about 80% compliance, and from what we're told by people who know more than I do about this, certainly 20% of the population could have a valid reason for an exemption. Drivers can suggest, oh, have you forgotten your mask, or ask someone, can you wear a mask? But it's not for the driver to enforce mask wearing, and I think that is an issue that we frequently come up against. And what is the role for the police, and what is the role for maybe a third party, community officers? We don't have the British Transport Police like the rail, and so it's difficult to get that engagement because, as you are well aware, the police have lots of other things to be doing. So it's scary for passengers, scary for drivers. We're trying to provide training and information where possible. And I'll pick up on a point that, if that's okay, on what Hussein was saying about onboard marking. That has been a difficult one, and various operators have thought to introduce different approaches to this. Should they mark out seats? Is that a scary thing for somebody to be coming onto a bus and seeing red tape across certain seats? I believe that the common approach is that you are encouraged to sit apart or sit at the window side and leave rows where possible. But if 4 people from the same family enter a bus, they are allowed to sit within 2 rows, take up 2 rows beside each other, because they are a bubble. So it's you want to be able to house those people close together, because you don't want to be separating a parent from their children, but also allow for people to have social distancing where possible. So it's a difficult one to provide cast iron concrete guidance when it's difficult for different family situations. I completely agree with the previous speakers around the problems associated with the Spaces for People fund, which was a quick adoption of measures to encourage walking and cycling. And there have been some fantastic projects delivered that will help sustainable and active travel. But I do feel that there were elements where there was not enough consultation, and that's not only with groups such as Disability Equality Scotland, but also with public transport operators who in the Aberdeen situation had 3 days notice of changes to where services could be run, and are now dealing with problems for access for people in wheelchairs. So that's a lesson we can learn as we go forward. So hopefully that's a quick rundown of where we are for buses over the last difficult 6 months or so.
Thanks, Paul, that's great. And you've picked up on a lot of comments that have come out of our poll, so I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions as we're going on. But if I can come maybe to Demi, just quickly from CalMac, can you just summarise, Demi, very quickly for us what's been happening on the ferry network?
Yeah, so a lot of the kind of similar challenges to what Paul had just said, a lot of risk assessments, a lot of assessing a landscape that was ever changing, and we weren't quite sure sometimes of the right thing to do, but that has evolved. The same kind of typical things that we spoke about, so face masks, obviously they were enforced. We're encouraging face masks. Obviously we know that there's those that are exempt. We joined in your campaign to obviously raise awareness in relation to exemptions and hate crime. So we have posters up about that just now on the vessels, and we posted that in our kind of internal sites for staff to raise awareness. The general things like floor markings, 1 metre distance is what we've got laid out. Some of the major vessels have a one-way system in place just to help the flow of traffic, but we've also gave kind of assistance to staff to say that this may be an unfamiliar environment for customers. Now, all customers, but maybe particularly those with disabilities, please be prepared to spend a little bit more time explaining what's going on, provide assistance, because obviously we do have a process for booking assistance, but generally someone might turn up and not realise that there was something that they weren't aware of. So just be considerate, be aware of the customer's ever-changing needs. And one of the things as well that happened to us, which was quite different from everyone else, was between March and June, there was a ban on all but essential travel to the island. So we stopped allowing any day trippers or any kind of family visits. It was only people who were residents of the island. So we had to enforce a process where proof of residency had to be given when you were boarding the ferry, which was something that we've never had to do before. But a positive that came out of it as well was we only have some routes that were online, the kind of major routes that you were able to book, but we managed to get that changed to have a lot of the turn up and go routes. Now you have availability to buy your tickets online, so that's something that's good that's came out of it. And the same as what Paul was saying, just promoting contactless payments as our preferred method, just obviously again to kind of minimise any type of interaction and help the kind of flow of traffic and not kind of bottlenecks or anything. I think that's it really. Yeah.
Thanks, Terry. Could I ask Mark to come in from ScotRail now, if that's okay? And very similarly, Mark, if you can maybe pick up a few things that ScotRail have been doing.
That would be my pleasure. Thank you. First of all, thank you to Hussein and Michael for, I think, what was largely a report of kind of positive experiences, albeit obviously imperfect and some challenges. So I'd like to kind of speak to some of the feedback that was raised earlier. And I'll start first of all with passenger assistance and the topic of staff visibility. We have been working quite closely with our trade unions to make sure that we have appropriate procedures in place for passenger assistance and appropriate PPE and instructions to staff. So because it is quite a close contact activity for obvious reasons. And I'm quite pleased to say that we got agreement with a revised form of staff protocol that is being used currently to continue to offer passenger assistance in roughly the same way that was being offered pre-COVID, and importantly, bookable through the same channels and with roughly the same timescales as well. We haven't had to, ask customers to give us 5 or 6 hours notice. We've maintained that the 2 hours notice window, which is really good. It would be remiss to say that staff visibility hasn't been a challenge, because it really has been. And Michael, we touched upon this on our call yesterday, but for the benefit of others on this particular webinar, I'll explain where ScotRail's at with that. We, at the introduction of lockdown, removed staff, on-train staff's revenue collection duties. The reason for that is it was felt that revenue collection was not an absolutely essential activity that justified coming into close proximity with our customers. That's both to maintain customer health and well-being and staff health and well-being. But we were critically clear at that point about passenger assistance duties obviously have to be maintained. What this has flushed out over the last few months is actually, whilst the conductor, for example, will inspect the platform and look for anyone who's requiring assistance or be aware of who's booked on the train to offer them assistance, Michael's experiences of that member of staff not being visible at any other time in the journey is feedback that we've had from several customers. And what we are doing is we're working with our trade unions very closely and at pace. And we feel we are almost at the point whereby revenue duties will be returning in the very near future. And as a result of that, you will find that on-train crew will be very visible again, because they will be walking through and constantly patrolling the carriage and be available for any queries, any general support that could be required from our customers. That doesn't mean that we're using revenue to drive this challenge. It's just the easiest and fastest means for us to fix the problem, if that makes sense. So it's kind of 2 birds with 1 stone for that one. The station's staff visibility has been a challenge too. We, like many operators, have had experiences of spikes in staff absence. due to people self-isolating, people having a positive test. It's actually become more of a challenge recently when Test and Trace has begun to identify individuals who have potentially been exposed and ask them to quarantine themselves. So that's been a challenge to handle, and obviously we don't want to go into a phase of very quick recruitment of temporary members of staff, because roles in transport are quite specialist. They require good safety knowledge and good customer service knowledge. So the best way of us actually handling that situation has been to basically reallocate the available station staff resource that we do have, and potentially move someone from a very quiet, very small station where there is little evidence of them offering customer benefit in the ticket office, and moving them to an area where we know they can be of more value if we've got a member of staff absent there. What that is doing is it is making the station ticket offices, which are open and closed, potentially variable on a daily basis. And that can therefore mean things like station toilet availability changes too. So we are in a almost constant state of making sure that we're updating knowledge base, which is the website which allows us to explain to our customers which facilities are open and closed. That's been changed on a near daily basis to make sure that it's really up to date. And we're clear with our customers on our website, you know, please do check your journey in advance, look at the facilities, just to make sure that you can make the trip that you want to make. So that's kind of the staff challenge that we've had. We've also had various other challenges with 5 timetable changes in the space of 5 months. Normally we do 2 a year. That's been really hard to execute. And the impact on customers has been, it's been quite difficult to make any long-term journey plans. And we are looking at the next timetable change being in early December, and really paying close attention to how we communicate that to our customers. There'll be a lot of announcements over the next couple of weeks on service alterations for December. The plan is that will be a very stable timetable, and that will be in place until May to give people certainty of the service level they can expect, and then make journey plans accordingly. And then I won't speak to physical distancing and hand sanitizer. It's very similar opportunities and challenges as Paul and Demi have articulated for the other operators. One point to leave you with though is that on train you'll notice that ScotRail has never taped off seats on a train. We felt that was the wrong thing to do for some of the challenges that Hussein articulated well originally. Some train operators south of the border chose to do that, to have colour coding on their seats, and they are now all reversing that process, given that they've seen it actually not offer the benefits that they expected it to, given that households are travelling together, that some customers are choosing not to follow the rules and breaking tape, and it's creating a maintenance cycle, which means it's not practical and it's not offering the value that it was expected to. So instead, following the ScotRail approach, which is to message customers with the 5 rules of safer travel, which clearly explains that a customer holds some responsibility as much as the train operator in determining what is a safe seat for them, and the supports that we have available to help a customer make that decision.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mark. That's really helpful. And I think we've touched on a number of kind of really key points that came out of the poll, including the passenger assistance and how any changes are being communicated to members of the public. I'm conscious of time. What I'm going to do at the moment is take a very short 5-minute comfort break to allow our BSL interpreters and our captioners to have a break and to catch up. We'll come back at 11:25. In that time, if anybody has any questions, please remember to submit them into the Q&A box. And when we come back, our panel will be able to take some questions from the floor. Remember, if you want to ask your question directly, please let us know and we can put you onto video if you need to use BSL. So we'll come back at 11:25 and we'll see you then. Thanks now. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us and for all of your questions over the break. We've got a couple of things coming in that I want to touch on first of all. I think from what we've heard from transport providers this morning, there's been a lot of change over the last few months, and people are very interested to hear how those changes are being communicated, particularly the measures that are in place to get that information out in accessible formats such as BSL and others. Could I ask each of the transport providers to say very quickly what kind of measures you have in place to communicate these changes? Mark, can I come to you?
Hello, thanks Emma. I was just individually responding to people's Q&A about that. It's very much something that ScotRail is actively considering, and to be perfectly honest, the voices within this webinar are just adding further weight to that. And I took this comfort break to fire off a reminder to my marketing colleagues to say, I'm on a webinar, that this is absolutely something that we need to do and to consider. So we would never want to create information resources which were inaccessible. Some of the questions around ScotRail's TV advert campaign was personally quite surprising to me. Everyone recorded for part of that campaign was wearing a face covering to reinforce the need to do that when you're traveling on public transport. And when we played that advert digitally, on YouTube, online, and through social media, it was all subtitled. But clearly, when that went out in broadcast television, the feedback from this group here is that it wasn't subtitled. So I've had to ask that question as to why that happened. That's definitely something for us to pick up. And this idea that the suggestion that we use BSL interpreters to overlay on top of a digital message is an excellent one. So that should be considered for all of our future campaigns. And what it's raising in my mind, and it's something that was raised at ScotRail Stakeholder Equality Group recently, is we've invested in enormous digital screens in the new Queen Street station that will have a variety of audio-visual content on them. And I'm now, again, kind of putting pressure on my colleagues in the marketing team to say, what are our plans to make sure that any assets we're going to use are accessible with BSL interpreter, with subtitles, because this is something which, we've invested in these screens. They're going to be around for a very long time. So thank you for the stimulus to make sure that we make this a priority. We will. Thanks,
Mark. Paul, can I come to you? Is that any similar work going on with the bus industry to make sure that people with sensory impairments are getting the right information, particularly as Hussein picked up on in terms of where you go and how you know which seats are free, etc.?
As Mark says, we want all information that goes out to be fully accessible, so there's clearly lessons to be learned. I haven't had a chance to go into the chat function because I'm working off a little tablet that freezes my image if I go into that, so I'll get a print off and go through all the comments that later today. But really, we have a range of members from the larger groups to very small rural operators, and ensuring any kind of uniformity of response is difficult for a trade association, but we can put out messages surrounding good practice. I know a lot of the larger operators are looking to on vehicle messaging and social media messaging, and I will have to just take the advice of the people on this webinar as to what are the best channels, what's expected, and ensure that good practice is fed across the piece. So I can't really speak to what every single operator's done because I don't know. There's too many. But yeah, any feedback that we can have of your anecdotal experience, I'll pass on and hopefully learn from.
Great, thanks very much. One of the other questions that came through, which actually links in with what you're saying there, Paul, is around kind of connectivity. Can the transport providers say they're doing any work around sort of working together to make sure transport hubs and new timetable changes are all kind of consistent?
Well, what I can say is that Mark was talking about the issues of service changes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Paul, hi.
Yeah, Mark was talking about the issues of service changes, and that's been very relevant for our sector to probably a greater extent. The timetable for the making a service change has been reduced markedly down to a 3-day short notice variation because of operators having to respond and react to changes in lockdown, where areas have been told do not travel by public transport, or where there's been changes to work patterns or anything like that. But people have tried to react quickly, and getting information about those changes out in time is a challenge. We are currently supported by Transport Scotland to provide a degree of basically pre-COVID network mileage, which is essential because if you consider that the costs of operating, your driver costs and your fuel costs remain the same, but your patronage is halved or worse. So there's a real hole there that the government has managed to fill, which we're glad for. But it does. There have been areas where there have been reductions in service due to either people aren't travelling or a variety of reasons, and we are working closely together to try and identify that. I mean, the agreement we have with Transport Scotland compels operators to consider where people are making their journeys and to ensure that resource is channeled into those areas. So again, if there are examples to feedback, I'll take that information back.
Thanks, Paul. I suppose one thing that has come through on the questions is about the kind of remote rural area and how services have been impacted there. Obviously, in these types of locations, there's a reduction in service in most cases. Has COVID had a particular impact in these areas in terms of either train or bus provision and what's being done remotely?
I'll come in again. I know that's 3 in a row, but I'll come in again quickly to just say, yes, rural transport is an issue pre-COVID. Post-COVID, it just magnifies that really in terms of reduced patronage, makes these services, the commercial case for running these services very, very difficult to make. And another aspect of that is in those rural areas, you may have smaller operators, many who are bus and coach operators who carry out maybe a school service, maybe one registered service, and then some coach work. Now, the coach sector has no support, essentially from no government support fund. So a number of coach operators, our bus and coach operators, the rural ones, are either shuttering their services for the duration of COVID or closing permanently. And that leaves a hole in rural areas. And that's something we've been flagging to government, that if these smaller operators can't survive because there's no coach tourism trade, then those smaller guys that provide vital links to school, home to school transport and some registered service work will go, and who's going to step in? So yeah, there is a real issue rurally.
Great, thanks, Paul. If I could just come back to both Hussein and Michael, we've talked a lot about communication and getting information out to disabled passengers. What kind of information would you be looking for and to make you feel more confident to travel? Is there something specific that transport providers could be looking to do? Hussein, can I come to you first?
I think just as I said before, it's the how do you do what you need to do? It's encouraging to hear, for example, today from Paul, from Mark as well, that the responsibility is on passengers to, for example, sit and maintain the physical distancing. If we knew that quite clearly before we travel, that okay, basically you just do whatever you follow the physical distancing guidelines yourself, and it's up to you, and you just work out yourself where to sit. Well, that at least gives us something to prepare for and something to think about and say, is that something that I'd be able to do, or is that something, for example, that I might need to ask a driver to assist? That then begs, for example, another question: are bus drivers, and I completely take on board what Paul has said, and I absolutely respect that bus drivers have fears, they have worries and uncertainty regarding COVID, just as we do, and absolutely to be accepted. But for example, are bus drivers being told that where people need assistance to find a seat, for example, it's okay for us to ask that? It sounds really silly, but I remember when lockdown first happened and I first took a taxi, asking the driver if it was okay for me to hold his arm for him to sighted guide me, because I just didn't know if that was something that was allowed anymore following the lockdown, and just because of all the restrictions that are going on. So I think communicating that to people, telling people that it's okay to ask, and telling people that yes, drivers will help, be that bus, rail, ferry, or community taxi, is just really, really important, because this virus, unfortunately, is going to be around with us for a long time. It's something that we're going to have to get used to for a long time before we go back to anything like normal. So we all need to almost relearn everything there is to learn about traveling all over again, so that we can do that safely. I'd love to get back to using buses again. I love trains, as a lot of people on this call will know, and really looking forward to getting back to that again. But at the moment, I'm using a fortune on taxis to get door to door, which I just can't sustain. And knowing exactly what I need to do, being reassured, even on issues where you might think, oh, well, we don't need to reassure people because it's obvious if you need help, you ask for it. Unfortunately, we're in a time now where these things are no longer obvious until we're told. And that, I think, is just a different way of thinking.
Thanks, Hussein. Michael, do you have anything to add at
Yeah.
this point?
Yeah, pretty much the same reflections. I think there was no information I could see published anywhere. You know, that passenger assistance would still be offered, and I think if that was communicated, you know, clearly early on, and I appreciate things have evolved throughout the lockdown. You know, so I mean, we heard Mark talk earlier about the effect it's had on the provision of staffing. But I think just having some message that passenger assistance is still available. You have the right to ask for it. You know, some information like that would have made me confident to go out and travel independently earlier on. And I just thought, well, I need to get, you know, give it a try and see what happens. And you know, if there's no assistance available, then you know, it's a new normal that I would have to try and adjust to. But I was pleasantly surprised to find that there was, you know, quite a lot of assistance available, and people were happy for me to take their arm. I think what happened, what helped a lot was Christina McKelvey, Minister for Equality and Older People, you know, quite categorically saying, well, it's okay during the pandemic to assist people that need assistance. I think transport operators, I mean, I have limited experience of anything other than rail, but it really would have been helpful had they kind of capitalized on that and you know, given that reassurance. I think the other thing is that there isn't a lot of information that I'm aware of, at least, about changes to the environments, you know, the one-way systems. And again, that was something that I was concerned about, anxious about in terms of traveling, because it's not something that my guide dog, especially as a new guide dog, would you know, really be able to comply with.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, you pick up on a really interesting point. I think our colleagues from Guide Dogs Scotland and RNIB have mentioned that it is a real issue for people with sight loss to try and navigate without that kind of tactile help. I suppose my question then to come back on that is around what information are transport providers feeding down into their client-facing staff about disability awareness in this kind of time? How has the way that we engage with passengers changed, and how is that information getting fed back? Mark, do you want to come in and say a bit about how passenger assistance has changed on ScotRail?
Thank you. How are we feeding information to frontline teams that provide assistance in terms of awareness of the needs of our customers? So we had to revise and revisit all of our protocols and guidance for passenger assistance, which was mainly to make sure that our people understood that when they are hearing a message from government, which is, you know, absolutely physically distanced from other people, actually there are so many nuanced circumstances where that is not appropriate, and in most cases, the delivery of passenger assistance requires a supportive arm to be offered or a wheelchair to be physically touched. And that is a legitimate set of circumstances where we don't expect physical distancing, and instead here's the protections that we put in place for that. So we had to give that to our people just to clarify any misconceptions, because and this is the same issue with customers and face coverings, Emma. The nuance got lost in a mandatory message, and we had to make sure that it was a two-part message. You know, please physically distance, but here's the circumstances where that isn't appropriate, and here's what to do about it. So we reissued all that guidance to our people. In terms of our customers, I am fully open to Michael's criticism of the information not being clear or good enough, that our passenger assistance was operating as you would normally expect. We put these messages on our website, but do you know, that clearly is not a one-size-fits-all communication approach, and I'd be really interested in views and suggestions about other possible channels that we could use to reinforce that message, because it was with no malice. I think we looked at the problem and, yep, we can still deliver passenger assistance. That's smashing. Okay, let's keep delivering it. And that needs to be, by the sounds of things, continuously reinforced and clarified. And that sounds like the right thing to do. So I'm open to some suggestions about alternative ways of us communicating that, please.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. Demi, is that a similar situation on the ferry network? How has passenger assistance changed there?
Yeah, so essentially it's just the exact same process that we would have had in place. What we maybe had the advantage of, as I explained before, we basically had a total drop in travel between the months of March and June. So throughout that time, I was obviously involved in different types of forums and chats, and I became aware of the challenges that maybe were presented in the rail and the bus network. So we maybe had that extra bit of time to get prepared. So we made sure that staff and passengers were aware of the service that you could provide. It basically is the exact same. You can be guided. There's no kind of restrictions in place for that whatsoever. We did provide PPE for staff if they felt if that made them more comfortable. But essentially, yeah, it was just the exact same process, and we tried to communicate that to customers and staff and reassure everyone that it would still be the same level of service.
Great, thanks, Demi. That's really helpful. One thing I did want to pick up on, and it's been mentioned already, is the kind of use of face coverings and how people feel about travelling. I mean, Hussein, Michael, could I come back to you at this point? Is this a concern for you when travelling, either putting you off if there are people on board who are not wearing a face covering, or for yourself? Is that something that you would consider an obstacle or a concern to getting back to using transport?
No, not for me particularly. I just need to remember to wear it, and sometimes I forget. You know, so sometimes I've walked into the station and I've been standing there, and I've actually been approached by staff, and they're very very kindly not pointed out to me you should have a face mask on. And then all of a sudden I remembered, and so that's not been an issue for me.
Hussein, how about you?
I think, hold on a second, my system is just Geiger me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. Again, just as Michael has said, not for me personally. The face mask message, I think, has been very strong right throughout. Like anyone else, sometimes I'll walk out the house and forget my mask, or get into a taxi and forget my mask. But I do have friends who are very, very concerned about face coverings. They are exempt from wearing a face covering, but they're torn between wearing one to keep themselves safe, to keep themselves healthy, versus obviously the impact that has on their health, versus being challenged for not having a face covering. I actually had a friend this week who wasn't aware of the Thistle card and the face mask exemption on there, and she's now gone and got herself the Thistle card, and she does feel a lot more comfortable now once I told her that the Thistle card has been extremely widely marketed, including I think on TV as well. But I think the message is strong, and I think it's starting to become stronger about the exemptions, but I think maybe it still needs to be reinforced a little bit more. There's a lot of people today, I think, in the questions in the chat that have said that they've been challenged and are feeling quite concerned and quite anxious about being challenged, and some people doing that in quite an aggressive way. So maybe that's somewhere where a bit of reinforcement is needed to say that, absolutely we should be wearing face coverings, but please bear in mind some people, as somebody said earlier, are not wearing them for a very good reason.
Great, thanks, Hussein. And I think it's Paul, you mentioned before there's been quite a high level of compliance with people. I know, Mark, you're similar on ScotRail, there's been high levels of compliance with people wearing face coverings. What kind of guidance, though, are you giving to your staff in terms of communicating with people who rely on lip reading, for example, where a clear visor would potentially be a way past that barrier? Has there been any kind of communication with staff on that, Paul?
Well, I mean, with the driver wearing face mask, you're talking about being able to communicate. In terms of that, the existence of the assault screen is sometimes it's essentially a clear visor between the driver and the passenger. So in those instances where you're on a bus that has that kind of assault screen, the driver may not be wearing a mask, as that is regarded as the equivalent. Some services do not have that, and the driver may be wearing a mask. We have looked at various solutions or alternatives there, and have taken driver feedback in as well around fogging, which is an issue that some experience with the sort of clear visors if they're driving, that you don't want to impact upon their visibility, and likewise wearing a mask if you're wearing glasses. So it's again, it's we've taken expert advice on what's required in terms of a mask, or is the assault screen a safe equivalent, but are also listening to the trade unions and our drivers as to what they feel is required. But it's a good point about those who may require to see somebody's or lip read. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I'll feed it back.
Absolutely, it's a learning process, I think, for all of us. Mark, can I come back to you? How are things like? How does that work on ScotRail services in terms of guidance for staff to remove a face covering if they need to communicate with someone who has sensory impairments and relies on lip reading?
So we to take it back to the risk assessments that were first carried out, when we were determining what PPE was required for each different type of role and each different type of activity, we identified the mobility assistants at the Network Rail managed stations, but also the welcome hosts and ScotRail stations, who are the predominant people that offer assistance, and they were provided with specialist visors for that very purpose. But for others, it was deemed more appropriate, for example, train crew, to have the face mask rather than a visor. And within the guidance that we reissued about the actual protocols to follow, we are advising our people that if they do have a secondary visor, to use that in lieu of their face covering, or if they don't and they can't safely remove their face covering, to use the Interpreter Now app on their staff-issued smartphone, which basically creates a relationship with a third-party interpreter on a smartphone who translates between our staff member and our customer using British Sign Language. And we've constantly reminded our people in their coronavirus briefings that they have this tool available, that it is on their smartphones. And I can tell you reassuringly from the billing that we get from Interpreter Now, it is being used, and it's being used more. We've noticed the cost increases, so that is reassuring to see. But nonetheless, we're not going to be complacent. And I think what was a quite strong briefing about the use of face visors probably needs to be revisited again if people have started reverting back to only wearing face coverings. So I'll take that one away. Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks, Mark. And Demi, is there any difference on the ferry network, or is it much the same?
Yeah, it's much the same. So the majority of staff are wearing masks, but we do have visors. It's more either a personal choice or what's more related to your job. And so the retail staff are they're the kind of staff that tend to have the visors on a lot more. They're dealing a lot more customer interaction, and they're moving around the vessels. In the port office, kind of the same as Paul said, we have screens, so they don't have to wear masks. They're clear screens at that point. In terms of if the staff member had to remove their mask if they weren't wearing a visor, we've got in our guidance as long as just to use their judgment, and if they are still maintaining their distance, then that should be fine. But again, it's personal preference. If anyone has any concerns, we have a process for raising it, but it hasn't caused any problems at all.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to pick up on one point that was raised earlier on relating to kind of the changes to infrastructure, specifically in relation to Spaces for People, which is an initiative that has been making some changes to the physical environment to make it easier to distance. So things like closing of roads or widening of pavements, etc. Hussein, can I come to you and say, have you noticed any changes to your usual route or your usual journey, either bus stops changing or travel hubs being a different way of entering?
So certainly within the city, there have been a lot of changes, and they have really affected transport. A lot of streets are now one way or blocked off completely. That's affected access to, for example, taxi ranks. I'm not really sure now where the taxi ranks are. The extension of pavements for cafes and other facilities have, as I mentioned before, caused these kind of floating bus stops in the middle of the street, which is, I'm feeling quite anxious here, and I haven't even left the house yet. But I think one of the things, Emma, that's really important again, and sounding like a bit of a broken record, but it needs to be said, is communication of that information, that we can actually find out where these changes are taking place, often at quite short notice by the council, and they're for the best of intentions to provide access for people to cycle, to walk, and so on. But for journey planning and getting this information through to the mapping services, to your transport planning services, be that Travelline, be that others, from the local authority, the local council, and anybody else that's involved in creating these, is essentially important, so that people can be prepared for what they're going to experience during their journey. They can make the alternative arrangements if it's needed. If that means, for example, taking a different bus route because the stop that they would normally get off is now no longer accessible, it's in the middle of a street, or they don't feel safe using that stop anymore. If that's having to use a taxi or a subway, for example, to get where they need to go, has that taxi rank changed? Are they going to be able to get door-to-door drop-off? That's become a big problem in the city now, because whole parts of streets have been essentially fenced off, meaning that there's no access for drop-off parking. So it is an issue that's being looked at. Max have done some work, as I put in the chat earlier, around the temporary changes and some of the points to consider before these changes are being made. But I think the whole process of communicating these changes to people, to journey, to passengers, to customers, to ordinary people planning their journeys is essentially important. And there is some work being done in some places, but I think there's still quite a long way to go on that journey to making that a system that really works for people.
Great, thank you. And can I just ask, in terms of Paul, maybe you can answer this. Have bus operators been involved in any discussions with Spaces for People in terms of changes to floating bus stops, etc., and have you had any input?
Well, Spaces for People. Sorry, yeah, Spaces for People. We have had limited access to that process, as I sort of mentioned in my opening remarks, that in some areas we've found very, very short notice about changes that have impacted severely on service provision in some areas and for accessibility. There's a couple, I think it's fair to say that there have been lessons learned. One of the concerns I have is that the government, Michael Matheson, relaunched the bus partnership fund yesterday at the Scottish Transport Summit, which is a £500 million fund for bus priority measures. We're worried that the political will to make changes to infrastructure will be diminished by the feedback that some local authorities have had to the Spaces for People projects that have been welcomed by some, and some are really good, I have to say, but in other areas have drawn ire and a lot of feedback, negative feedback from certain groups. So I think what one of the saving graces that we have is that the Transport Scotland Directorate for accessible travel and for active travel are also the directorate responsible for bus. So there's synergy there. So hopefully we can see a holistic approach to these kind of measures going forward, so that any kind of bus priority looks at improvements for walking and cycling, but also fully considers the needs of accessibility, and likewise further spaces for people projects or active travel projects, and learn their lessons and consider accessibility and bus as well, so that the mistakes that, and as I said, through COVID there was bound to be missteps and things that were rushed, and maybe this is one we can chalk up to that, but hopefully lessons have been learned.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, but I would like to ask, just for the transport providers, if they could say very quickly what the one thing that they would say to disabled passengers if they were to try and reassure them that their service is safe for travel. Demi, if I can come to you first, what would be the one kind of message you would like to leave disabled people with?
I couldn't go off mute there. The one message is just that obviously things aren't normal, but everything is still open for business. Every passenger can still travel as they planned to before. There will be support. It is safe, it is accessible, and any help or assistance that you may want or you're unsure about, you have any questions, we're more than happy to help and support. And don't be worried or anxious about it, because we will do everything that we can to help.
Fantastic, thanks, Demi. Mark, what about ScotRail? What was the message you'd like to leave?
That it's an ever-changing landscape, and more announcements being made this afternoon about the restriction levels at a local authority. If your local authority rules allow, please consider the train for your travelling needs. We're here, all of our contact channels are open as they would normally be to make arrangements. And if you have the opportunity to speak to ScotRail about your travelling needs and make assistance bookings, we can offer one-to-one reassurance about the service that you will receive and articulate how it is probably going to be different from previous journeys you've made with us, to hopefully reassure you about the experience that you're going to have and manage your expectations. It's not normal, but we are doing our very best by you. Thanks.
Thank you. And Paul? I think Paul may well have frozen. I think then in the meantime, what I'll do is, if I could ask Hussein, could you say what the kind of one thing that would help to reassure you to travel? What would be that kind of confidence that you're looking for from providers?
I think it's so often we're told that there's no such thing as a daft question. And I think I would reverse that and say there's no such thing as a daft answer. So, more is better than less, especially in these circumstances, to reassure people. So even if it seems really obvious, tell us about what you're providing, tell us about how we should be doing things, tell us about what we're able to do, what we're able to ask for, and we'll be more than happy to travel with you.
Thank you. And Michael, anything to add to that? Anything that you
would
want
just
to ensure?
I mean, the only thing I'd add to that is perhaps we've had a lot of conversation around what is available, but it would actually be quite useful to also have something about what transport providers cannot do now.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody on our panel today. I think that's been a really useful discussion, and I hope the transport providers have taken something away from today, and that our audience listening have been able to be reassured to return to public transport. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions today. Any that we haven't managed to answer live, we will put those to the providers and come back to you. While we also send out our little survey to say thank you for your time and to tell us how we did today. But all that remains is thank you again for everybody for your time this morning. It's been a really useful discussion, and we'll see you again on another webinar soon.
Thank you.